All right. I want to thank everyone for coming to the Sam Houston State University Undergraduate Research Symposium. I want to thank Sam for hosting the event and allowing me to present this project. And I want to thank, most of all, Dr. Zachary Bachman. He's my philosophy professor and faculty advisor, and so much of this would not be possible without him and his help and guidance on this project. So let's get into forgiveness and self-respect. So, one of the reasons that I'm interested in forgiveness from the perspective of a philosopher is because we feel really, really strong emotions whenever we think about forgiveness, whenever we think about us forgiving or having been forgiven. There's this very powerful feeling that we have. However, we have a hard time describing what it is despite these very strong emotions. And so, this naturally has led me and many others to be very interested in the topic of forgiveness. And one central question is, what reasons do we have to forgive? Despite these strong feelings, is there a rational justification behind these emotions? And so, after reading a lot of literature and philosophy covering forgiveness, I've developed what I call the standard account, which is like an aggregate view of what most people who are philosophers will say. There are some who differ, but for the most part, this is what you'll find in a standard paper that's written on philosophy. I'm sorry, written on forgiveness in philosophy. And so the first thesis that you'll find in a standard account of forgiveness is that forgiveness is the forswearing of resentment. Forswearing here can mean that it is transcending resentment, it is overcoming it, or it's simply getting rid of it. And resentment here is meant to portray moral outrage against a person specifically. So, not necessarily their action, and that's what I call umbrage, moral outrage against the action. But resentment is about the moral outrage against a person. And the reason that we are overcoming resentment whenever we're forgiving them is because we feel moral outrage against the person in this case. So that's why we would forgive. And so the second thesis that you'll find in a standard account of forgiveness is that forgiveness is fundamentally other regarding. The reasons for our forgiveness regard some feature or fact about the other person, the offender in this case. And I contrast this in the paper with self regarding, which would be the reasons we have to forgive regard some feature or fact about ourselves. And then the third thesis, based on those first two theses that you'll find in any standard account, is that forgiveness is warranted only if the offender gives us a reason to forgive them. And so this comes up whenever we take a look at a puzzle that often comes up in these papers, which is that how is it that we can no longer be mad with someone who's done something wrong against us while also not somehow condoning their action? Well, philosophers tend to think that forgiveness does not condone the action if it can follow three rules. The victim knows that they have moral worth, you know that what the offender did is wrong, and the offender can reasonably be expected not to have done the wrong. As long as forgiveness follows those three rules, it can not fall into condoning. Well, it turns out the only reason that can make sure that forgiveness follows all three of those rules, according to the standard account, is that the offender has to give us the reason to forgive them. This is usually that they repent, which is that they apologize for what they've done. They say that what they've done is wrong and that they won't do it again. But not in every case is repentance the solution. But in every case, it is that the offender has to give us the reason to forgive them in order for it to be warranted. Now, I have some problems with the standard account, and the first problem is about thesis 2 and 3, and it can be summarized with the question, what do we do if the offender gives us no reason to forgive them? If we are supposed to regard something in the offender to forgive them, and that thing that we are regarding is whatever reason they give us to forgive them, well, what happens when they don't give us a reason? Well, unfortunately, either implicitly or sometimes explicitly stated in the different accounts that could fall underneath the standard account of forgiveness, they say that we have to prolong our resentment against them until they do actually give us a reason. And as we'll see later, that has some moral problems to it. And then the second issue with the standard account is with thesis 1, and that is that there's an incomplete analysis of resentment. When they're developing the first thesis of the standard account, the different philosophers will focus on what forgiveness is and why we forgive. But that same thing cannot be said about resentment. There's a focus on what resentment is, which is our moral outrage against a person, but there's no why of resentment specifically. They usually will explain why we react negatively to someone doing something, and they usually say that we're standing up for our self-respect or we're standing up for morality in general, but that's simply an explanation of why we have a negative reaction in the first place, not necessarily why we feel resentment over, say, umbrage, like I said earlier, or sadness or disappointment. And so in order to come up with the best reasons, or at least the most accurate reasons that we have to forgive our offender, we have to ask that question: why is it that we feel resentment? So that's what I do in the paper. And so I ask the question, why do we feel resentment? So when we think about what is going on when someone has done a wrong against us, we aren't just upset that they have done something against us. It's that the reason we're upset with them is because they have made a claim in their offense against us. And that claim is something along the lines of, you do not have enough moral worth for me to not treat you in this way, or you simply aren't morally worthy of being treated better than this. I can get away with this action because you do not have the amount of moral worth that would require me not doing this against you. And so when we react with resentment, we're reacting against this claim specifically. I mean, it's a very defensive reaction. We're sort of putting up our guard, but we're also at the same time very upset with them because of the claim that they have made against our moral worth. We don't feel umbrage because it's not necessarily against their action that we're upset. It's against them. And that's why I say that resentment is portraying an insecurity. It's an insecurity about our own moral worth whenever someone brings, you could say that they bring evidence against the claim that we have moral worth, and that we are insecure that this evidence might actually diminish the value that we have. And so forgiveness then, if forgiveness is about overcoming resentment, forgiveness is about overcoming our insecurity about our moral worth. It's about reaffirming our self-respect. And so this reason is self-regarding. It regards the fact that we are insecure about moral worth. It doesn't regard anything about what the offender has done or did. It's about this insecurity. And on top of that, we always have this reason. Whenever we feel resentment against them, we are portraying this insecurity. And so we always have a reason to forgive. We always have a reason to forgive because we always have a reason to respect ourselves. And so we can see that we have this reason when we reflect on the process, because, you know, this is all very abstract. It doesn't seem very connected to what's going on whenever we're experiencing forgiveness. But when we reflect on the process, this becomes a lot clearer. Now, in this process of forgiveness, I have listed it as like first, second, third. So it seems like there's an order to the process, but this is just the order that I happen to write it in the paper. There is no specific order that these have to get done, but these steps are usually what we do whenever we forgive someone. And so the first step is that we have to intellectually grasp that we have moral worth and should not be treated in objectionable ways. And so this is what I call recovering our self-esteem. Forgiveness is the process of emotionally understanding that we have moral worth and coming to a place where we can overcome that anger. But the first thing we should do is at least rationally understand it, not necessarily emotionally, but rationally understand it. The second step would be that we have to recognize that the offense is wrong. Because if for some reason we could figure out a way to justify their action, that would not really give us a reason to be upset with them. They haven't actually done anything wrong. And so once we realize, oh, yes, they have done something wrong, then the next thing we have to do is, so why am I so angry about it? Why am I not only angry with the thing, why am I angry with the person who has done the offense against us? And we have to come to terms with this reason. We have to come to terms with, oh, I'm feeling insecure. And not, what am I feeling insecure about? Oh, well, they said I'm the type of person that this action is acceptable against. Well, I don't think that's correct. And once we acknowledge the feelings, once we come to terms with what it is our emotions are saying, the next thing we do is we express that, we communicate that with the offender. Now, obviously, this can't be the case if the person is dangerous or if they're dead or across the country. So we will oftentimes communicate with the person in a regular case of forgiveness, but in extraordinary cases, we may have to communicate with a close friend or family member, a therapist, a pastor, etc. But what we're doing is we're communicating what we've just realized in the third step, that, hey, you have done something against me that is wrong, and you're making a claim about who I am and what you can do against me that is wrong. And I don't think that that's correct. And so the last thing that we do once we had this communication, regardless of what it is that they have said, because remember, this is a self-regarding reason, the reason is regarding ourselves, is we have to assess our relationship with the offender. How serious was the offense against us? Are they the type of person who you should not be in a relationship with because they're dangerous or they're going to do it again and they'll continue to do it again? Maybe none of those things apply and it's worth it to return to the relationship. All of these are figuring out, is my self-worth going to be compromised by me being in this relationship? And so once we go through this whole process of forgiveness, once this process is complete, we come to a place where we're ready to emotionally grasp our moral worth, forswear our resentment, and forgive the offender. And so these are the sources that I used to write this paper and to help make this presentation. If you have any question about any of the sources that are appearing here, or if you have any questions about my project overall, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.